Chris Callahan off the East Coast, and he's going to be talking to us about some different software packages that are coming out for keeping track of food safety records, which is on the rise. Okay, and you don't see this very much when you see extension people testing sprays, testing equipment. You don't see much assessment of software packages, but as it is a higher tech world, Chris took a stab at it.
And it is just a stab. It's a start. It's a very dynamic world, the software world in general, and especially as it relates to farm records and farm management. And that's sort of the context that I think about this in. This is not just about produce safety record keeping. It's not just about FSMA or GAPS. If you're keeping records about one thing on the farm, chances are it impacts many different parts of the farm. So I'm going to try to keep that in context. Some of the key points, if folks have to leave the session early, the records needed were based on a review of the Produce Safety Rule, and in particular the Produce Safety Alliance National Curriculum. That outlines that very well. Anybody here been through a PSA training? So you may remember the different modules in the PSA training. They probably look very familiar in the list up here. And at the end of each of those modules, the last slide in each module is what records should be kept. So we used that as a starting point. We went back through the Produce Safety Rule, and really we're looking at record-keeping systems that would meet those requirements, and also take into account other user requirements on the right-hand side. So get into how we arrived at those a little bit. The other thing is the Produce Safety Rule does not explicitly require a food safety plan. That said, why not? Why not have one, and why not incorporate that into your record-keeping system? And so that's why those last two are starred. So why even think about this? Well, clearly one motivation is the FSMA Produce Safety Rule. It will require additional record keeping. That at least the other thing I should preface all this with is this project was really focused on Vermont growers. Vermont growers are quite different from Michigan growers based on what I've learned in the past 3 days in terms of the scale of operation, the diversity of crops. I mean, it is not uncommon for a farm in Vermont to be growing 60 or more crops, and then multiple varieties. So we have small, highly diverse farms. So the record keeping related to that is a different animal than, say, a more specialized commodity crop grower. So the motivation for this was finding some systems that would not only just work for our growers, but add value to the operation as well. We also had increasing demand from wholesale buyers for improved record keeping at the point of sale. So even something as simple as making sure everything was labeled. So that continues to be a bit of a challenge for some growers. And so these were the motivations for looking into this. And the project that we did, it was funded by the Vermont Agency of Agriculture through the USDA Special Crop Block grant program, as well as Vermont Housing Conservation Board. And the idea was, our going in assumption was, we'd look at what the users need, what the regulations require for record keeping, what buyers are looking for. We'll go shop the market and see what's out there for solutions, do a pre-select, and get to a point where we can pilot a few of these solutions. That was the going in assumption. Things went a little bit differently, and we'll get into that. These are some of the Produce Safety Rule specific record keeping requirements, employee training and health. So a lot of the record keeping has to do with documenting the fact that you've delivered a training to your workers, and that it was according to a given training material, and it was given by somebody who is qualified to deliver the training. Employee health and hygiene, you're keeping track of when employees are sick, and you're keeping track of the toilet hand washing facilities that you make available to them. Record keeping for soil amendments, I think this might be another area where we differ pretty significantly. We have a quite a bit of use of compost as a soil amendment, and I'm not sure the same might be true here. Is that a fair assessment? So when you start to use compost as a soil amendment, your record keeping becomes more significant. And particularly on farm, if you're doing the composting on farm, you need to track the scientifically validated process for making compost. Land assessment has to do with before you go and plant, you're doing an assessment of the area where you're going to plant to assess for hazards and risks related to food safety, as well as before you harvest. So I think I heard somebody refer to it yesterday as pre-ops, which was a new term for me. Ag water comes in at least two flavors. One is production water, so that's water used for irrigation, frost protection, things before before the product is harvested. The record keeping here has been a point of pretty significant debate, especially as it relates to the test method used to test for E. coli, generic E. coli. And under the produce safety rule, there are some pretty somewhat complex calculations that need to be done on farm to keep track of your ag water quality profile over time. So a record keeping system should be able to capture this and do some of that calculation for you. Harvest, post-harvest, and traceability requirements. The traceability requirements for the produce safety rule are pretty straightforward. You need to be able to trace one up and one down. So where did it come from and where did it go to? That said, it gets a little more complicated when you think about how much exposure are you willing to take on one sale. So and how you allocate your lot number will determine how many sales get piled together into a single lot if there is a need for a recall. I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so, as I mentioned, a food safety plan is not required by the produce safety rule, but may be required by other certification programs. Buyers, for example, may require one, or if you're in some other form of audit system, you may need one. And the other point is, if you've gone through the Produce Safety Alliance training, you're pretty close to having a plan developed at that point, and so it probably makes sense to do so. And then the other thing that came out of our review or our survey of farmer users was just the general ability to upload just about any kind of document with some sort of time date stamp, some sort of tag. You know, this is field A or tractor 21, and so being able to just, use the most common documentation system almost all of us have to get information into a system. So just a general collection of documents. So we did a survey of Vermont growers, and most of them were already doing some form of tracking and data collection, typically related to harvest and packing. I think most record keeping that was being done was related to production and getting a better handle on production practices, impact on yield, quality, and labor. Excuse me. Most were using a field notebook and handwritten notes, but some were using electronic records. Everybody who responded to the survey is using a computer on the farm in some way, 3/4 of whom are using a smartphone or a tablet for most of their data. And then about a third are using a smartphone in the field as part of their record keeping. We also talked to buyers as part of the survey and tried to get a handle on what they were most interested in, and it really had to do with communication, written communication at the time of sale. And so that's something we were looking at as well. How do you get the data into a label for use by a buyer? So when we synthesized the farmer feedback on record keeping, it was some of the sort of obvious things, but some of it was very helpful to have synthesized. It's about making it quick, easy, and flexible. And sometimes those things do not support one another, right? The minute you make something quick and easy, it may not necessarily be flexible. So what did we do? We looked at over 60 software solutions. We were able to do an initial down select to 17 based primarily on alignment with our requirements, but also because of the group of, or the demographics we were looking at, we also considered factors like cost and customer support and things like that. And we ended up choosing 5 for further piloting. I should say just yesterday I learned of 3 new options that we didn't know about. One was Orizant Sapphire, we're in the room. One was PickTrace and one was T3. And I learned about them because they're all exhibitors. And I'd encourage you, if you're considering record-keeping systems, to visit those folks. I had, in particular, a very nice conversation with the folks who have Sapphire. And I think when you take a look at where we landed, it's actually quite similar. So we didn't know about you when we did this, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
And so these were the sort of the final group that we looked at. Sorry, it was 6. So some of these may be familiar. Ag Squared, is anybody familiar with Ag Squared or using it? FarmOS is an open source farm management record keeping system. Tend is sort of a new entrant that's still, at the time we were doing this, very much in development. Gap Pro, which is a sort of a cousin to Cog Pro, if there are any organic growers in the room. Cog Pro is intended for organic certification record keeping. Harvest Mark and Food Logic Q. You can see these are grouped according to sort of what category we think they kind of fell into. Some solutions are very much farm planning, farm management focused, and they may not yet know about produce safety record keeping requirements. Some are very much focused on traceability, and they may have been developed for traceability in aircraft parts, but are now being adapted to produce or other food products. And some are more merged in where they came from. Where we landed, though, was no solution that we looked at was really doing everything that was sort of needed based on our survey. Just real quick overview. So this is a screenshot of Ag Squared on a smartphone. It's a nice user interface. It's really built around farm management. Many of the food safety features really are somewhat workarounds or add-ons to the base structure. One of the really important things we felt we had to account for was CSV import or export, and CSV is comma separated variable. So if you can get something into a CSV file format, you can get it into just about any other data platform. Why does that matter? A couple of reasons. One, if you want to be able to look at your data, say just in Excel, to browse or Google Sheets, any spreadsheet system, you get it into a CSV, you can get it into those systems and really have a lot more flexibility to do any sort of data analysis or filtering. The other reason is, let's say you choose to move to a different platform down the road. The ability to export your data, to know that that data belongs to you, is important, especially if you've taken the time to build up your crop list and your field lists and your employee lists. Not having to re-enter that is really important. So CSV or some sort of import-export functionality was very important to the users we surveyed. The ability to customize for a specific user is also another important factor, or the ability for the user to customize, as the case may be. So anyway, Ag Squared, when we spoke with them, they were trying to add FSMA record keeping functionality, still not quite there at the time we wrapped this up. FarmOS, I'll get into in more detail toward the end of this presentation, because we ended up doing quite a bit of work in that platform. It's a cloud-based record-keeping system based on an open-source web database platform called Drupal. There are a lot of databases built on Drupal, and it's fairly open and flexible. So this is a particular application of Drupal Open source, meaning that it's not just one person developing it, it's developed and the code is freely available for others to then use, adapt, improve. And so the idea of adding a produce safety module to this framework was very attractive. A couple of other examples, or at least one other example, they've had somebody develop a grazing module. So anybody, I don't know if anybody here has livestock, that's another feature of some of our farms in Vermont, is they're not just produce, they have livestock as well. They're really integrated operations. So the ability to look at the data management from a whole farm perspective was really important. Gap Pro we talked about, nice simple form to put a water test result in. This is based or shares a lot of commonality with Cog Pro. It really is focused on gap, USDA gaps. And many of these platforms were developed as desktop applications with mobile applications from the start, which is nice. Here's the desktop view of Gap Pro. It looks a lot like a notebook. So just from an interface perspective, it's something familiar. Harvest Mark was another one we looked at. Was a much larger, much more focused on larger scale systems than where we were focused for our user base. And the same with Food Logic Q. And as a result of some of that sort of scale difference, we actually had a bit of a hard time getting some engagement with some of these providers, and so it's a little bit difficult to trial something if you don't have that. So I think it's important to make that note. We weren't able to get as deep into every single solution we reviewed. So a summary of review that we did, most of the systems that we saw were really focused on wholesale growers, and we actually have quite a bit of direct retail and farmers market, CSA farms, so it was more tricky to account for those sales. Customization of systems certainly can be done, but tends to be fairly expensive if you have engagement in the first place, which is a bit challenging, like I said. Although traceability software is widely available, and also there are farm management software systems widely available, the combination of the two was sort of elusive based on our review. And so where we landed was three main things. Produce Safety Alliance has templates for record keeping, which are paper-based templates or Word document templates. We developed a set of Google Sheets. Most of our growers who had developed their own record-keeping system, digital record-keeping system, did so in spreadsheets. And so you can link between sheets and things like that. So if you assign a harvest lot number, you can pull that into a pack record sheet without having to redo it. So we thought a set of standardized Google Sheets would be helpful. And then we ended up working closely with FarmOS to develop a produce safety module for their farm data management system. I'm just keeping track of time here. I want to make sure I have time for questions. Here are the Produce Safety Alliance templates. So are folks aware of the Produce Safety Alliance? Produce Safety Alliance is responsible for the national curriculum for produce safety rule training. And so there's actually a Produce Safety Alliance or PSA training going on right now as part of Great Lakes Expo. So I just want to show you the PSA website. So real quick, if you, we maintain a project page for this project. If you go to go.uvm.edu/produce tracking, you can find the final project report. We have some project videos, and I'll be adding some new information based on this trip as well. That's go.uvm.edu/produce tracking. Back to Produce Safety Alliance. So they have a really nice set of resources on their webpage. And I'm looking particularly for the templates, which I believe are under resources. And so they have things like the specific to modules, the water module, land use, sanitation, and oh look, record keeping. So they have a nice overview, for example, of a record keeping, which is a PDF. And so it walks you through the record keeping requirements of the produce safety rule, and actually highlights the templates that they've produced. The templates are also at the end of this PDF in PDF form. If you don't like PDF form, you can get them as Word format. We'll see if we have Word. All right, so here's a Word format. So they start right off the bat with, do you qualify for an exemption to the produce safety rule based on sales of produce? And then this is an employee training log in Word, and it goes on from there. They have water system inspection, water treatment, etc. So at the very least, there are standardized templates that you can have in a notebook or on a clipboard, and you are meeting your record keeping requirement. If you want something more, we've covered a couple of the solutions, the digital solutions. I want to show one in particular that we've been working with quite a bit. This is FarmOS. This is where you land when you come into FarmOS. FarmOS, you can just download the code if you are so inclined and build your own site based on it if you or a loved one are involved in web development. The most likely approach to doing this is actually subscribing to a hosting service. So Farmier, the parent company to FarmOS, actually provides hosting services. $50 a year. They set you up with an account, and you end up with this dashboard. And when you get into the dashboard, you can have your farm fields laid out. And so all of this is called geometry, the way FarmOS is sort of structured is areas, assets, logs, and people. Areas are the where, assets are what, so a piece of equipment, a field, crop, a planting, a herd. Logs are the activities, so how do things interact with each other, as well as when something happens. And then people are just what you think, the workers, and as well as outside reviewers. So you can set up an account for an outside reviewer and maybe just give them limited visibility into certain records. So that could be an auditor, it could be a state inspector, etc. So we go into the produce safety section. It's laid out according to the modules of the PSA. So worker health and hygiene, biological soil amendments, domesticated and wild animals, agricultural water. Each one of these has templates for record keeping. So let's say we wanted to capture a specific training. We click on add log. It gives us a date stamp and a time stamp. We fill in the training topic. We describe the training materials. We can select from a pre-populated list of trainers as well as attendees. And so this is pulling from your people, the people section of FarmOS. You can add some notes, and then the other thing, which isn't showing up here for some reason, is to upload you can upload a photo or a roster, a photo of the roster. Oh, here it is, sorry. He changed the navigation on me. So you can upload just about anything you want. And if you're looking at this on a phone, there would be a take a picture option here as well. So you could just snap a picture of a sign-in sheet, it uploads, and you're done. So that's pretty slick. Where was I? The other...
Yeah, 5.
Thank you. Yep. The other logs. So the logs sort of follow the same general format. So if we did a specific water test, you give it a name. So maybe it was pack house tap water, and then you could note the laboratory, the result, etc. Or you could simply upload a picture of the lab result. Again, same sort of way. So that structure is actually very similar to where Sapphire has landed based on my conversation with them yesterday. And so it's a very, I was really pleased to know there's another option out there that's more integrated than what we saw elsewhere. Again, key points, there is clarity on the records needed for produce safety record keeping. The things that really drove our work had to do with user input and what people were looking for in our cohort, which may not be the same as your cohort. So it's, there are different options out there. There are a lot of them. And our main thing was how well does it integrate with the general farm data management record keeping that already exists. I didn't do this by myself. So Stan Ward, Michael Kilpatrick, and Michael Stenta were very involved in this. We did have review from the Produce Safety Alliance. We had generous sponsors who helped us get the work done. And if you want more information, there's the page. Happy to have some discussion, questions, thoughts. Yeah.
What's the range of subscription fees that for the 6 that you landed on to investigate more?
So 10 at this point was a beta available for free with fairly limited functionality. And so they were trying to get users and gain feedback so that they could further develop it. So that was the one far end. Food Logic Q and Harvest Mark were up in the $2,000 and $3,000 a year subscription range. It sounds like most providers are getting into a lower subscription fee and then getting into basically it's something similar to like a cell phone plan where you pay your base fee and then you pay also based on use. There may be some shifting in that as well. Yeah.
You mentioned in your surveys of your growers that they were using like maybe Google Sheets. Were they using Google Forms as well to coordinate those together? And were people getting really extensive with that? Or?
Limited use of Google Forms, although I think it's a really good opportunity. So Google Forms, for those who aren't familiar, basically presents you with a form, almost like a survey form. So if you create that, you essentially force specific data entry, and so it's more standardized. One of the reasons folks were not using that is they tended to be using Excel for starters. The other thing too is the spreadsheet that Google Forms feeds is sort of flat, right? And so a lot of people in other words, it adds a line each time you add an entry. So if you've got other sheets being driven by that data, having it keep up with the new data is a bit tricky, given the sort of standard Google Sheets user base. But it can be done, but it's a little bit trickier. Yeah.
Just in comment to that, you can use that for data entry, but the last we checked with the SISMA requirements and with most auditing, you'll have to print it out because unless a record can't be changed after entry, you can't use it for constant upkeep.
It's a great point. So for any records that will become important during an inspection or an audit, there is this requirement to have it locked and not be editable at some point. Yeah.
Did any of those have spray record keeping?
So FarmOS can do it, I believe, based on what I looked at yesterday with Sapphire. You can create a log that is a spraying log. So you can say where did it happen, what was sprayed, what rate, who did it. That's what you get from a flexible system, right? Is if you start with a really simple structure that lets you just capture where, what, who, and when, you can build any log you want from it.
Thank you, Chris.
Yep, thanks.